My concentration was abruptly shattered by the extremely loud and out-of-place sound of an airliner careening down the island of Manhattan. Minutes later in my office, I was facing the inconceivable scene being watched by millions. Black smoke pouring out of one of the World Trade Center towers. What separated me from the millions, my husband was in one of the towers, and I didn't know which one. At 9:02, it would make little difference as I watched the second plane swing around and slam into the second tower. Both towers were now hit and burning. The shock setting in would be completely embedded into my being as I watched the first tower fall, now knowing it was Rich's building. It would be 3 days before I would get any information regarding what Rich had endured. He, along with a group of colleagues, was waiting on the 78th floor sky lobby for one of the express elevators when the second plane hit. The group and approximately 200 others in the sky lobby at the time were thrown around as the building swayed from the impact. Rich was hit by the marble walls, which fell on his legs, breaking and/or crushing them. He was pinned under the marble debris and unable to move. He was waiting for rescue, most likely under the most gruesome conditions imaginable. Fire, smoke, dead, dying, and quite possibly the sound of the building collapsing and falling apart. Imagine their relief when Battalion Chief Oreo Palmer and Fire Marshal Ronnie Bucca appeared, like angels to help them to safety. These unbelievable men were in the process of coordinating the evacuation of the injured when the building collapsed, stealing their last breath, crushing every person still in there to death. Only 59 minutes after impact. They never had a chance. In my voice, hear the voices of all the victims of the needless, horrible murder crying out. Let my voice, on behalf of all the victims, implore you to listen, and listen well. Families left behind to suffer from the memories of this atrocity are too many. We have an obligation to the victims, the families, and the citizens of the United States to look at what went wrong and to make sure we do everything in our power to ensure safety and security in buildings going forward. We must first separate the events of September 11th into two categories: the terrorist attacks and the subsequent building failures, which alone encompass a variety of appalling conditions. Unbelievably, evacuation emergency preparedness were sorely lacking or totally non-existent on 9/11. This, along with critical flaws in the design and construction of the buildings, contributed to the ominous conditions occupants found themselves in, which ultimately claimed the lives of thousands. I am here today to speak about evacuation emergency preparedness. On September 10th, I, like so many of you, had little knowledge in this area. I, like so many of you, entrusted my family's security and safety to others. That ignorance changed one day later. During the course of the past 2 years, I have been shocked to discover how very deadly that decision was. In order to properly move forward, we must first go back. As the World Trade Center began to accept tenants in December of 1970, it was fairly common knowledge among those close to the project that there were inherent problems, safety issues, if you will. The construction of the buildings will be termed fragile by their critics, the fire service, the very service commanded to protect it. The towers shot upward into the sky to the height of 110 stories, a quarter mile. They contained lightweight floors, acre-large expanses of open floor space, substandard fireproofing. The thinnest, lightest steel would be found at the top. Worst of all, these innovative, experimental mammoth buildings were constructed and opened without any automated sprinkler system installed in them. Subsequently, in any major fire, the risk would be great. There were no fire barriers on these acre spans of open floor space, no water, still the best measure against fire. Any fire was free to spread, and spread quickly. The potential occupancy of each tower was 25,000. Each tower had only 3 staircases, clustered in the center core of the building along with the elevators, and contained no cement or masonry. The only protection afforded in any emergency or evacuation, whether stairs or elevators, were 2 layers of fire-rated gypsum board or drywall. The World Trade Center, over the course of its life, would have numerous incidents which would give the Port Authority the opportunity to address the very serious challenges regarding the safety and security of the occupants. As would become all too evident, the strategy of defend in place would not work in any major fire in these buildings. Their inherent design flaws, and most importantly, the inadequate, untested fireproofing, would require full evacuations each time. Unbelievably, with all the warnings, the Port Authority and its arrogance claiming that these were indestructible buildings never prepared their tenants for that eventuality. On September 11th, this negligence would cost the lives of thousands, and the faulty fireproofing would play a major role in bringing the buildings down. Before midnight in February of '75, an arson fire was started at the Trade Center inside a closet with telephone switching equipment, cabinets filled with paper, and fluid for office machines. This, combined with the open floor design, allowed a fire to get out of control very quickly. It would take 132 firefighters 3 hours to finally put it out. Fire Commissioner O'Hagan stated at the time, had the building been fully occupied and given the stack action that exists in this 110-story building, the rescue problem would have been tremendous. Although it was night, everyone had to evacuate. The maintenance workers, cleaners, security. Pressure was applied and the Port Authority made some concessions. They installed more walls and doors on open floors. They improved some of the alarms and communications. They installed fire smoke detectors. Yet the one sure thing to help control a fire was ignored: water. The sprinkler systems were just too costly to install. In '81, the Trade Center towers had another scare. A Boeing 707 on its way to JFK International Airport missed hitting the tower by a mere 90 seconds. What had been speculative was now a reality. One of the risks to the towers and their occupants now included the danger of collision by a commercial airliner and fire from its jet fuel. During the '80s, the Port Authority finally set the funds aside and started the sprinkler installation, which would happen over the course of many years. In '84, with growing concern with the global climate and terrorism, Peter Goldmark, who was the executive director of the World Trade Center at the Port Authority at the time, ordered a report on the vulnerability of the towers. The Office of Special Planning was born and charged with the task. Appointed to oversee the project was Edward O'Sullivan. He spoke with many domestic and international intelligence agencies and conducted a top-to-bottom investigation of the towers, an assessment. And it was clearly evident that there were numbers of vulnerabilities: the danger of a potential bomb in the parking garage, a plane hitting the towers. Even a building collapse was a serious concern. When they questioned Leslie Robertson, the original structural engineer, with this concern, he claimed that the towers were Gibraltar. By the time the report was eventually completed, Mr. Goldmark had left the Port Authority. He was no longer there. Consequently, the excellent recommendations of eliminating the public parking, or at the very least, doing random checks of cars coming into the garage, dispersing the emergency centers, installing better internal radios, battery-powered lighting, more video cameras, these were all ignored. The poor decision-making about the recommendations would come back to haunt the Port Authority on February 26th in '93, when a bomb did go off in the sub-basement it had been feared. The lack of the additional security in the parking area allowed the van loaded with explosives to enter. The lack of emergency lighting made the evacuation of thousands a terrifying experience. The lack of the proper venting, the stack effect, caused a life-threatening risk with the smoke that eventually covered the entire towers. During the '93 evacuation, the lack of preparedness was blatantly evident. People didn't know what to do. They didn't know where to go. The standard optional drills, which consisted of moving to a designated area, going down 2 floors, and waiting for instructions, the defend-in-place strategy, didn't help in this extreme circumstance. The evacuation lasted over 10 hours, and the buildings quickly filled up with black acrid smoke. Everything went out: lights, ventilation, elevators stopped, trapping people in the cars filled with smoke. Some tried to walk down to safety, only to return because it was too smoky to come back, to go all the way down. People were absolutely terrified. Those who knew the building's construction well, the Port Authority engineers, they were able to dig their way through the gypsum board with keys and nail files and escape from a stopped elevator. Others went down through dark, smoky stairwells, holding onto the shoulder of the person in front of them. The stairwells quickly became crowded, as people from other floors entered. Several were rescued by helicopter off the South Tower. After the 93 bombing, some safety improvements were made. Battery-operated emergency lighting was installed in the stairwells. Luminescent paint was added. A separate emergency command center was put in each building. The ever inadequate and in some places non-existent fireproofing was finally to be increased to 1.5 inches, 3 times the amount that was currently on the trusses. This was to be done as tenants moved out. It would set a potential time frame for completion at over 10 years. At 9/11, it had not been completed. For most, the years following the 93 bombing resulted in complacency. For Morgan Stanley, more vigilance. This company took the initiative to make sure its employees would know exactly what to do if there was ever another emergency. The only way to accomplish this was to practice, practice, and practice. As a result of the constant drilling on the morning of 9/11, the only casualties Morgan Stanley sustained were those of the employees going back to help others. So far, each and every incident that occurred at the Trade Center was an opportunity for an honest, critical look at the safety of the buildings, at the evacuation of, and potential problems with, the evacuation of getting nearly 50,000 occupants out quickly. It was an opportunity to address these things in order to minimize injury or death in the event of another major catastrophe. The bombing in 93 was a major indication that evacuation of these buildings was a very real problem, and a comprehensive plan needed to be drawn up, fine-tuned, disseminated, implemented, and practiced. An enormous task, to be sure, but these were enormous buildings, and they brought with them enormous responsibility. On the morning of September 11th, the first day of school and primary voting would delay many, thereby saving their lives. Unfortunately, many, too many, were at their desks. Occupants of the towers consisted of the usual diversity: employees, people from branch offices for day meetings, companies conducting breakfast meetings, visitors, messengers. When the planes hit the towers, they virtually sliced right through the buildings, penetrating the soft curtain with little to no resistance, taking with them all means of escape above the impact zone in Tower 1, and leaving a lone and barely known about stairway open in Tower 2. What happened in those towers is unforgivable. Untold numbers were instantly killed because they were in the direct path of the planes. Those at and above the point of impact in Tower 1 endured unimaginable conditions, as is evident by the number who chose to leap to their death. Others tried frantically to escape, only to learn that every potential access to safety was closed to them. The stairwells were gone and the elevators were gone. Unable to go down, the soon-to-be victims went up. Up to the roof where they encountered locked doors. No one had bothered to tell them that rooftop rescue was no longer an option. Their only escape and chance at survival would have been a rooftop rescue. They waited for help that would never come, a quarter-mile above ground. These innocent souls stood at windows waving to attract attention, hoping and praying that someone would reach them in time. Last calls were made, final messages were sent. Too smoky, can't breathe. Should we break a window? What should we do? Where should we go? How do we get out? In Tower 2, similar events were occurring. The difference? Tower 2 had a critical 15-minute window of opportunity to evacuate, a missed opportunity to minimize the casualties. Instead, occupants were told to stay, to go back. Many already in the process of leaving the building turned around, trusting the announcements that the building was secure. That decision would cost them their lives. Once again, untold numbers were killed by the planes. Once again, others would find themselves searching for a way out, only to be met by locked doors. Stairwells that were destroyed, elevators that didn't work. Some were trapped in offices. Again, the roof was sought as a point of rescue. Again, locked doors, wasting precious minutes going up, instead of finding the one lone staircase left, never having been told the rooftop rescue was not an option. Again, final messages were sent. Too smoky, can't breathe. The ceiling is falling in. The floor is giving way. The stairwells are blocked. The stairwells are gone. Some of these soon-to-be victims were on phones with loved ones pleading for information and options. No communication from the Port Authority was forthcoming. Innocent victims sitting in offices waiting for instructions on what to do, most likely contemplating their fate. Innocent victims waiting for rescue. All of them perished, many while still on the phone with their loved ones. These memories will haunt us forever. At present, there are 2 investigations of the World Trade Center being conducted. Congress has charged the National Institute of Standards and Technology with the daunting task of conducting a federal investigation into the building failures. Columbia University is conducting an evacuation study. These investigations, along with others around the world, will hopefully submit very concise recommendations which will address the safety and security of occupants and buildings. It is our hope that this commission will push to make sure that those recommendations end up fast-tracked into best practices. It is our hope that this commission will make an irrefutable statement that it is imperative for all concerned, real estate, architects, builders, code groups, fire service, and advocates for safety, to speak in one voice to ensure that recommendations become mandates quickly. It is our fervent hope that the first obvious recommendation issued by this commission is the immediate removal of the immunities to critical building and fire codes, the bare minimum standards, which are currently still enjoyed by the Port Authority in the construction of the new World Trade Center as I speak to you now. Safety concerns need to be addressed before construction begins, not after. Economic gains cannot be allowed to dictate what those safety measures will be. Emergency preparedness cannot be allowed to remain a vague notion. We must educate all citizens to be able to get out of a life-threatening situation quickly. We must provide them with the tool, knowledge. The responsibility must rest with anyone potentially affected, building owners, building managers, tenants, employers, and employees. In closing, I would like to say that prior to September 11th, I was simply a wife and mother. My life's goal was never to be a public spokesperson or advocate. However, that horrible day has changed my life dramatically. I am honored to be heard on behalf of all the families whose lives will never be the same. I sincerely hope that this commission understands a legacy of truth, accountability, and reform is the greatest tribute to all the innocent victims of this tragedy. The time has come to address the deadly mistakes of 9/11. A safer environment for our children and for all of America will be a direct result. We now look to you for leadership. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Regenhard, you.
Good morning, Chairman Kane, Vice Chairman Hamilton, and Commissioners. It is an honor to address the 9/11 Commission today. My name is Sally Regenhard, and I'm the founder and chairperson of the Skyscraper Safety Campaign. The Skyscraper Safety Campaign was created in December 2001 by the Regenhard family in memory of my beloved son, Christian Michael Otto Regenhard, 28-year-old probationary firefighter who remains missing at the World Trade Center, along with his entire engine company 279 to this date. He is one of 17 probationary firefighters lost at the World Trade Center and is one of the 45% of victims whose remains were never found. I brought a picture of him today because pictures of the victims I know inspired this wonderful commission. And I brought his picture today to represent all the victims, whether uniformed or civilian. And I know that you will keep them in mind as you go about your most important work. The goals of the Skyscraper Safety Campaign are, first, to have a federal comprehensive investigation with subpoena power into the collapse of the World Trade Center. This investigation is currently going on. Secondly, to encourage better compliance with building and fire codes in New York City and nationwide. Third, to educate codes groups to allow the fire service to have more input into the writing of building codes, which now, sadly, is not the case. Fourth, to ensure that all future World Trade Center development by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey will be characterized by safety, quality, security, and will be under the legal jurisdiction of New York City Building and Fire Codes. My remarks today will focus on the skyscraper safety issues of 9/11/01. On 9/11, the cloak of competence was pulled off the city of New York. On that dreadful day, we found out how ill-prepared we really were, and this knowledge came at an awful price. The needless death of nearly 3,000 people, 343 of them firefighters, including my beautiful son, Christian. On 9/11, the City of New York and the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey had no plan for terrorism, despite the fact that the World Trade Center was previously attacked in 1993 with deadly consequences. At that time, the terrorists vowed to return to, quote, finish the job, and they kept that promise on 9/11. The widespread failures in evacuation procedures, building code issues, and emergency communications became a prescription for disaster at the World Trade Center. Despite propaganda to the contrary, the Port Authority, a bi-state agency which built the World Trade Center and is totally immune from all local building and fire codes, really had no evacuation procedures in place at all. They said they did training, but the fact is that evacuation was left up to the individual tenants, not to the Port Authority. The majority of the occupants who survived felt that they were improperly trained or not trained at all. If they were trained, they would never have gone up to the roof to try to escape. All those who made that crucial mistake paid dearly with their lives. If they were properly trained, they would have known that access to the roof was impossible because of 2 locked doors that were only accessible to maintenance workers with keys. The inadequacy of codes to ensure safety of persons in high-rise buildings became glaringly apparent on 9/11. In 2001, the New York City building codes, as well as all model codes throughout this country, treated a 100-story building with the same guidelines as a 10-story building. No fire drills with full building evacuations were ever mandated, and the World Trade Center occupants were just as totally unprepared for a mass evacuation as they were during the 1993 attack. New York City codes allowed a building designed to house 25,000 people to have only 3 staircases for emergency escape. It allowed gypsum board walls and stairways, which at the World Trade Center collapsed under impact and pressure, trapping fleeing victims. New York City codes allowed many or all of a high-rise building stairwells doors to be locked, trapping fleeing victims when stairs collapsed and preventing firefighters from gaining timely access to floors where people needed to be rescued. The unfortunate truth is that today, very little has changed in the area of building code reform throughout this country, including few extra safety measures for high-rise buildings. But any discussion of the New York City Code is completely irrelevant to the World Trade Center because these buildings were and remain above the law. The Port Authority's buildings were totally immune from every single New York City building and fire code and were subject to, quote, the Port Authority's own codes, which remain a mystery to this day because no one has ever seen them. The Port Authority repeatedly claims that they, quote, meet or exceed New York City codes. However, history has shown that this is a falsehood. No high-rise building of 100% bar joist floor construction before or since the World Trade Center has ever been allowed under New York City standards and practices. According to the NIST WTC collapse investigation, there is no evidence that fire tests were ever done on the fireproofing of the World Trade Center. This is a glaring example of lack of code compliance, to say the very least. Finally, the untested fireproofing was grossly inadequate, a clear violation of New York City codes. However, since no FDNY violations can be issued to such a, quote, immune building, no codes violations were ever served on these dangerous buildings. Indeed, the FDNY had no jurisdiction in the World Trade Center, but paradoxically, they were required to risk and eventually lose their lives in these buildings. One of the most tragic and abominable failures of 9/11 was the total breakdown of emergency communication and coordination in the World Trade Center. Lacking any real plan for terrorism and lacking a unified command structure, the Port Authority, NYPD, and the FDNY operated basically separately on 9/11. For the most part, they did not and could not communicate with one another. The FDNY generally could not even communicate among their fellow firefighters. Numerous newspaper articles, interviews, and 9/11 tapes have evidenced this fact. The fact that my son and his FDNY brothers were sent into the World Trade Center with radios that did not work in 1993 and were no more capable of working in 2001 resulted in evacuation orders which were unheard and therefore unheeded, a fact that surely contributed to their deaths. In an effort to minimize the atrocity of the deaths of 343 firefighters, heroic urban legends were promulgated by leaders such as the former mayor of New York and others who still claim to this day that, quote, 25,000 people were rescued by the FDNY in the largest rescue effort in world history. To the contrary, evacuation specialists and researchers have determined that the true number of occupants who escaped that day was closer to 7,000 people per tower, a total of 14,000 people. The sad truth is that whoever could get out did get out. And while the FDNY valiantly entered these buildings to save lives, it was an impossible and deadly situation. They were essentially sent in to an inevitable death with radios which did not work. To this day, no one has been held accountable or responsible for these massive failures of the public trust. Since 9/11, we are moving in the direction of change, but far too slowly. Generally, we are crawling instead of running towards change. One outstanding exception to this situation is the New York City Department of Buildings and its World Trade Center Building Code Task Force, which is effecting sweeping changes and reform for New York City's building code. In February of 2003, this proactive department of the Bloomberg administration approved comprehensive safety measures such as the temporary outlawing of bar joist floor assembly, commonly known as truss construction, which characterized the World Trade Center, in high-rise buildings. They are also calling for the hardening of cores of staircases and elevator banks, the retrofitting of sprinklers in older buildings, and other safeguards which will be incorporated into New York City Building Code. As the Skyscraper Safety Campaign praises such actions, however, we are greatly dismayed that there is still unbelievably widespread resistance to national reform. One example of this is the fact that all model codes still treat a 100-story building with the same guidelines as a 10-story building. Another example is evidenced in the recent failures of a codes group to initiate basic fire safety reform through the widening of staircases in new high-rise buildings. For example, the National Fire Protection Association, the NFPA, recently had the opportunity to effect the code change of widening staircases in newly constructed skyscrapers by just 1 foot, yet failed to do so. Who can forget the stories of narrow, congested stairwells in the World Trade Center, where it was impossible for firefighters to go up while people were fleeing for their lives, and vice versa? Scores of still photos of persons evacuating demonstrate that occupants had to stop and turn sideways every time firefighters passed them on the way up because the stairways were so narrow. How many of those deadly 110 stories did my beautiful son climb up on that dreadful day against the tide of frantic, desperate people fleeing for their lives? Whose child, husband, parent, or sibling could have escaped by fleeing more quickly down a wider staircase? Did my son somehow get word of the ordered to evacuate but could not because he, like the other desperate people, was jammed into a too narrow staircase with a frantic sea of humanity trying to run for their lives. What unspeakable horrors led to the brutal deaths of nearly 3,000 people in those buildings that day? The cruel reality is that I will never know the answers to these devastating questions, but I do know that a staircase that is 1 foot wider can save a life. Most regrettably, the NFPA yielded to special interest groups and did not pass this most basic building code reform. The Skyscraper Safety Campaign now requests that the leadership of this fine commission becomes a catalyst for most needed code change throughout this country. The recent fires in Rhode Island and Chicago illustrate that disasters which happen locally should have national implications for change and reform. Yet, they nearly always remain a local issue. One example of this is the Seton Hall, New Jersey dorm fire disaster, which resulted in widespread reform in fire safety and sprinkler installation for college dorms in New Jersey, but not across the country. I appeal to this commission to further the cause of the skyscraper safety by doing the following. First, closely monitor the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST investigations, findings, and recommendations, and encourage new coalitions of public-private partnerships with the goal of adopting these changes for the purpose of code reform and enhancement of fire safety and evacuation procedures for all buildings. Secondly, make sure that the NIST recommendations for code changes are quickly adopted. It now can take from 3 to 6 years to change codes and practices. We cannot wait that long to safeguard the American public. There must be a national perspective from all disasters like the World Trade Center, the Rhode Island fire, and the Chicago fire. We need the shepherding of this 9/11 Commission to effect timely code change led by the International Code Council and the National Fire Protection Association. Third, invite the 2 key organizations which control public safety in buildings in this country, the NFPA and the International Codes Councils, to testify at your commission as to specifically how they are positioning themselves to quickly move forward on anticipated NIST proposed code changes. The Skyscraper Safety Campaign has established a relationship with the International Codes Council, and we look forward to working with both the NFPA and the ICC with the goal of widening staircases and incorporating many other safety reforms into these codes. Fourth, invite the General Services Administration, the GSA, and the Building Owners and Managers Association, BOMA, to testify as to why they opposed the widening of staircases in new high-rise buildings under the proposed NFPA code changes, which were defeated. Fifth, encourage reform in codes groups to allow greater participation from the fire service and fire professionals in the field of codes and practices. Allow the profession of fire protection engineering to have responsibility for fireproofing and fire safety issues in building construction. At present, architects who are not fire experts have this obligation. Sixth, and last, require that the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey rebuild the new World Trade Center under the legal jurisdiction of New York City building and fire codes. We need a set of national codes and standards with input from the fire safety professionals for all buildings, including governmental agencies. There should be no exemptions for any agency or authority, and the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey should not be allowed to rebuild the new World Trade Center under their immunities from local building and fire codes. No building should be above the law when fire safety is the issue. To conclude, please keep in mind that no reformed codes and no method of enforcement will be of any value to safeguard the American public unless there is a system of accountability and responsibility in place. We need this for the effective safeguarding of human life in all buildings, and especially for the failures of 9/11 in New York City. There was a wholesale betrayal of all those in the World Trade Center and all the rescue workers who ran into a hopeless situation with radios that did not work. The former mayor, fire commissioner, and police commissioner of New York, as well as the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, are just some of the individuals who must be questioned by this commission regarding what happened to New York City on 9/11 and why the greatest city in the world was so totally unprepared for this terrorist attack, despite warnings. Accountability and responsibility are the hallmarks of a democratic society. Without a system of accountability and responsibility for all public and private officials, there will be no real impetus to change an irresponsible system like the one that characterized the city of New York and the World Trade Center on 9/11. In closing, I would like to tell you that the writer Gertrude Stein once said that the dead speak to us. Members of the 9/11 Commission, the dead are speaking to us today. They are asking you, by your work, to give others the gift of life through accountability, responsibility, change, and reform. The dead are speaking to us. I hope that you will listen to them. Thank you.